learn Japanese history.
We are your navigators, Taro and Hanako.
Today, we're diving deep into the Jiyu Minkan Undu.
That's the freedom and people's rights movement.
And this is, well, it's a really pivotal period if you want to understand how things like a national assembly and political parties first got started in Japan.
Absolutely. For anyone trying to get a handle on Japanese history, this movement is crucial. It really lays the groundwork for modern Japanese politics.
So where do we start? I guess after the Seinan War, things shifted, right?
Yeah, exactly. The focus moved away from, actual fighting, armed rebellion.
And more towards
Wordless advocacy,
yeah.
Using speech, using writing. It was a big change in tactics.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the key players early on. The Rishisha, founded by Itagaki Teisuke.
That's right, down in his home turf, Kochi. It wasn't just some small local thing, though.
No.
It became, really important for spreading these new ideas about people's rights and also bringing Western knowledge to younger people.
Like a kind of study group spreading revolutionary ideas.
Sort of, yeah. Thinkers like Rousseau, Mill. Their ideas about natural rights, popular sovereignty.
That must have felt pretty radical in Meiji Japan.
Oh, definitely. It was a direct challenge to the old ways, the hierarchy. Gave people a real intellectual basis for, questioning things.
And then you have the prefectural assemblies starting up in 1879.
Right. Now, that might not sound earth-shattering initially.
But it mattered.
It did, because it pulled in local figures. Landowners, wealthier farmers, people with clout locally.
So it gave them a taste of politics, made them more aware.
Exactly. It was like a training ground, in a way. Showed them how collective action could work.
And this local activity then feeds into bigger things.
Yes, you start seeing these political groups, Meisha, popping up all over.
Meisha, local political associations.
Yeah, and they weren't just talking shops. They were organizing petitions, holding meetings, really connecting those big national ideas to local concerns.
Which led to reviving the Aikokusha, the Society of Patriots.
Right. These groups wanted to link up, make their voices louder on a national scale.
Now, here's something interesting. It wasn't just about ideals, was it? There were economic factors, too.
Oh, definitely. In the late 1870s, prices for things like rice went up.
So farmers were doing a bit better financially.
Seems like it. And that extra bit of financial freedom
meant they had more time or money to get involved.
That's the thinking, yeah. When you're not just struggling to survive day to day, you have the space to think about and act on bigger issues, support the movement.
So we've got all these different groups, economic shifts.
Yeah.
What was the one big thing they all agreed on?
The central goal, the thing that really united everyone, was getting a national assembly established.
A parliament, basically. A national representative body.
Exactly, where the people's voice could actually be heard at the national level.
And things really came to a head in Osaka in 1880.
Yes, that was a key moment. Representatives from all these different groups, these relay groups, gathered in Osaka, the Aikokusha meeting.
And that led to the League for the Establishment of a National Assembly, the Kokai Kisedome.
Precisely. Figures like Kono Hironaka, Katioka Kenkichi, they were leading the charge.
And they put together that huge petition.
Over 87,000 signatures, think about that for the time, demanding a national assembly. That's serious public pressure.
Yeah, you can't just ignore that. So how did the government react? Were they happy about this?
Well, not entirely. The response was two-pronged, really.
Okay.
On one hand, they tried to clamp down. They brought in new rules, assembly regulations to restrict public gatherings, trying to control the movement.
But on the other hand,
they also started working behind the scenes on their own plan for constitutional government. Government-led, mind you.
So trying to control the process.
Yeah.
But it sounds like there wasn't even agreement within the government itself.
Not at all. There was a major split. You had Okuma Shikinobu pushing hard for quick action.
What did he want?
He wanted a constitution fast, open the National Assembly quickly, and importantly, adopt a British-style parliamentary system.
Meaning political parties would be central. Parliament holds the power.
Exactly. A big shift away from direct imperial rule towards a government accountable to Parliament.
And the other side? Who was against that?
People like Iwakura Tomomi. They argued for a much slower, more cautious approach.
What was their preferred model?
They looked more towards Germany, a German-style constitution which keeps the emperor much more powerful, more top-down.
So a constitution granted by the emperor, not necessarily limiting his power in the same way.
Right. Keeping imperial authority strong was key for them.
And then, right in the middle of all this, there's a scandal. The Kaitakushi land thing?
Oh yeah, the Kaitakushi Kanyubutsu Harassage Jiken, that blew up.
What happened?
Basically, the government had a plan to sell off state businesses up in Hokkaido, managed by the colonization office, the Kaitakushi,
Okay.
at really cheap prices to companies connected to powerful figures like Godai Tomatsu.
Ah, smells like corruption.
That's exactly how the public saw it. Huge outcry. It really damaged the government's image, raised questions about favoritism.
So public trust is dropping, just as this movement for more rights is rising. That sounds unstable.
Extremely. And on top of that, they were also arguing internally about how to fix the government's financial problems, which were getting worse.
Wow. Okay, so the government's under pressure from all sides, which leads us to the Meiji 14th year coup. Sounds dramatic.
It was a decisive moment. To sort of regain control and set a clear direction, the government leadership doubled down.
No.
They decided firmly on the German model for the Constitution. And then, in 1881, they issued this really important imperial rescript.
The one promising a national assembly.
Yes, promising it would finally open in 1890. So a debt was set, but it was nearly a decade away.
And what else happened in this coup?
At the same time, Okuma Shigunobu, the guy pushing for the faster British-style reforms, was kicked out of the government.
Ousted, yep.
And that controversial Kaitakushi land sale plan canceled, likely due to the public anger.
So the ruling faction basically consolidated power, got rid of the main internal opposition, and set the course towards a specific, more conservative type of constitution.
Pretty much. That's the essence of the Meiji 14th year coup, or Meiji Juyonen no Seihen,
And the result?
a government firmly controlled by the Sacho clique, the oligarchs from Satsuma and Choshu, with Ito Hirobumi really emerging as the central figure. It basically decided what kind of constitutional government Japan was going to get.
But that promise of an assembly in 1890, even if distant, must have spurred the movement on in a new way. Like now there was a concrete goalpost.
Absolutely. It immediately led to the next phase, forming actual political parties.
Okay, who formed first?
Right after the promise, the League for the Establishment of a National Assembly basically transformed itself
Into
the Liberal Party, the Jiutu, with
Right.
Itagaki Taisuke as the leader.
Makes sense. And then Okuma having been kicked out of government.
The very next year, 1882, he formed his own party, the Constitutional Progressive Party, or Rikin Kaishinto.
Yeah. So now you have two main opposition parties. How did they actually operate? How did they try to win support?
They were very active. They held public speaking events all over the place, trying to explain their ideas.
Rallies and speeches.
Yeah, and they started newspapers too, crucial for getting their message out, building support. They were aiming to create real party politics.
Who were they appealing to? Who joined these parties?
They drew support from, well, urban intellectuals, lots of former samurai finding a new role, but also those local power players we mentioned, landowners, wealthy farmers, even merchants, people with a stake in how things were run.
And were these two parties basically the same, just with different leaders? Or were there real differences?
Oh, quite different, actually, ideologically and in spirit.
How so?
The Liberal Party, the G2, tended to be more passionate, maybe more radical. Some say it carried that spirit of the Shishi, those activists from the Restoration period, more focused on strong popular rights.
And Okuma's constitutional progressives, the Keishintu.
They were generally seen as more moderate, more gradualist.
Right.
They often pointed to the British parliamentary system as their ideal, stable, ordered progress.
Interesting contrast. Was there any party supporting the government side?
There was an attempt. A guy named Fukuchi Genichiro formed the Imperial Constitutional Party, the Rikin Taiseitu.
A pro-government party.
Yeah, but it just didn't catch on, didn't get much popular support, and fizzled out pretty quickly.
Okay, so we have parties forming, debating.
Yeah.
But this era also had some really dramatic moments, right? Like the attack on Itagaki Taisuke.
Yes, that was huge. April 1882 in Gifu. He was attacked, stabbed several times after a meeting.
And that's when he supposedly said, Itagaki may die, but freedom will not.
Right. Such a famous line.
It is famous, isn't it? And
Right.
incredibly powerful, but the reality might be a bit more complex.
Oh, he didn't say it.
Well, later accounts, even Itagaki's own memories suggest his immediate reaction was maybe less theatrical. Some reports say he just cried out in pain. Others mention something simpler like, even if I die, liberty is immortal. So the iconic version might be a later embellishment, boosted by his supporters.
It's very possible. It certainly became a powerful rallying cry, regardless of the exact words at the exact moment. It shows how stories get shaped, doesn't it?
Definitely. And there's a weird little footnote there, too, right, about the doctor,
Yeah, kind of amazing. The doctor who treated his wounds was Goto Shinpei.
who later became a really big deal in government himself.
Exactly. Small world, even back then.
So, alongside these dramatic events and party politics, people were actually writing their own constitutions.
Yes. This is fascinating. The Shigi Kenpap, or private draft constitutions.
Private citizens just drafting constitutions?
Not just citizens, though many were.
Yeah.
Also, activists, intellectuals, even some government officials were sketching out their ideal blueprints for Japan's future. We know of more than 40 different drafts from this time.
Wow. What kinds of ideas were common in these drafts?
Generally speaking, most of them proposed a constitutional monarchy. So, keeping the emperor, but...
But with defined powers and recognizing people's rights.
Exactly, rights and freedoms were usually included, though it's worth noting most also proposed limits on who could vote. Universal suffrage wasn't typically on the table yet.
Were they all pretty similar, or were there big differences?
Big differences. For example, one influential draft, the Kojunsha draft, linked to Fukuzawa Yukichi's followers.
What did that propose?
It leaned heavily towards the British model, a two-house legislature, like Parliament. The monarch delegates power to a government that answers to the legislature.
Okay, that sounds like Okuma's party line.
Pretty much, that was a dominant strand of thought. But then you had others.
More radical ones.
Yeah, people like Ueki Amori from Itagaki's Rishisha group in Kochi. His draft, and the Rishisha's own draft, envisioned a much stronger role for the people. How
Okay.
so? They often proposed just one legislative house, a unicameral assembly with significant popular legislative power. The monarch would handle the executive side, and they tended to have much broader lists of guaranteed rights.
Including things like the right to resist. I read that somewhere.
Some went that far, yes. Like the Minkokusha draft. The idea of a right to resist unlawful government actions that was seriously radical for the time shows the depth of commitment to popular sovereignty in some circles.
And some drafts were actually more conservative.
Oh, yes. Some leaned more towards monarchism, emphasizing imperial authority even within a constitutional framework. It was a real spectrum of ideas.
What about the May 4th Constitution draft? The Itsukaichi Kenpushan. That one's interesting because of who wrote it, right?
Exactly. It wasn't famous intellectuals. It was discovered decades later, just sitting in an old storehouse in what's now part of Tokyo.
And it was written by...
A local study group, the Gakuge Kodankai, formed around 1880. Mostly commoners, ordinary people, not elites. They got together and hammered out this incredibly detailed draft, 204 articles.
Amazing. What was special about it?
The sheer emphasis on human rights. Over half the articles, like 115 of them, were dedicated just to defining and protecting the rights of the people.
Like what?
Freedom of association, freedom of assembly, privacy of mail, protection of property. Really comprehensive. It shows how deeply these ideas about rights had spread beyond just the intellectual circle.
It's incredible. But despite all this energy, all these ideas, the movement itself started to fade after a while.
It did begin to decline, yeah. Several things contributed.
Like the government pushing back.
Definitely. The government used a mix of tactics. On one hand, outright suppression, stricter laws, arrests. On the other, they tried to co-opt people, offering government jobs to some activists to sort of buy them off or divide the movement.
And internal problems, too.
Yes, infighting and disagreements within the movement grew. Plus, money became an issue. There was an economic downturn affecting rural areas, which cut off funding and support.
And this led some people to get more radical. Direct action.
Exactly. Frustration grew, and some elements turned towards violence against the government.
Which brings us to things like the Fukushima incident.
Right, 1882, farmers and Liberal Party members protesting heavy taxes and forced labor for road building. The governor cracked down, made arrests.
And there were others. Kaba Mountain, Chichibu.
Yes, similar uprisings, often involving Liberal Party members, flared up in eastern Japan. The Kaba Mountain incident, and then the really big one, the Chichibu incident in 1884.
Tell us about Chichibu. That sounds like it was on a different scale.
It was. The Chichibu region in Saitama was mountainous, poor, and hit incredibly hard by the economic depression, especially the crash in silk prices, which was vital there.
So desperation.
Deep desperation. Impoverished farmers formed their own group, the Poor People's Party, the Konmintu. They were influenced by some of the more radical Liberal Party ideas.
And it escalated.
Massively. November 1884, thousands of farmers revolted. Their demands were stark. Stop debt collections for 10 years, let us pay debts back over 40 years, close schools for 3 years to save money, cut taxes.
Wow, and they used force.
They attacked moneylenders, police stations, local government offices. It was a full-blown rebellion.
How did the government respond?
They sent in the army, suppressed it brutally. 7 leaders, including Toshiro Isuke, were eventually executed.
That's harsh.
It was. There's a story about one leader, Inu Udenzo, who escaped and hid his identity for 35 years before telling his family.
Incredible. Is Chichibu considered part of the main freedom and people's rights movement, though?
That's debated. Some historians see it more as a traditional peasant uprising about debt and poverty, rather than being primarily driven by the political ideals of the Jiyu Minkan Undu.
The lines can be blurry.
And these violent incidents, did they hurt the main parties?
Absolutely. The Liberal Party leadership was losing control, alarmed by the radicalism. They actually dissolved the party shortly before the Chichibu incident.
They disbanded.
Yes. And Okuma's Constitutional Progressive Party also basically stopped functioning as an active party around the same time. So the formal party structure collapsed.
But the idea didn't die completely. People still wanted that assembly. No, the underlying desire was still there. As 1890 got closer, there was another attempt to regroup. The Grand Coalition movement, the Daidu Denketsu Undu.
Trying to unite the opposition again.
Exactly. Trying to build a common front for when the assembly finally opened. They latched on to the issue of the unequal treaties in 1887.
Using nationalism. Demanding treaty revision.
Yes, alongside the old demands. Lower land taxes, freedom of speech and assembly. It was a way to rally support.
And the government's response this time.
Clamp down again. They issued the Peace Preservation Ordinance Honjure.
What did that do?
It gave the government power to basically kick activists out of Tokyo. And they did. Expelled scores of key figures from the capital.
Effectively silencing the movement again.
Pretty much suppressed it, yeah. Made organizing very difficult.
It's interesting how we even get glimpses of this atmosphere from foreigners living in Japan, like Georges Bigot, the cartoonist.
Right, Bigot is fascinating. He was often very critical of the government, especially censorship.
And he also did that piece on the police, the busy life of a policeman.
Yeah, in 1891, it's almost like a little documentary manga showing police doing everyday things, catching thieves, helping lost kids. Quite diligent.
Even though his other cartoons often attacked police repression.
Exactly. It's a slightly different, more nuanced take, showing their role in just maintaining public order in this modernizing city. There's that funny panel of a policeman giving directions.
Of course, I only show straight roads.
Right. A little dig, perhaps, but mostly focused on the daily grind.
But his earlier cartoon, The Fly, that one was pure political satire, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. 1888. It directly depicts police telling journalists not to write nice things about Bigot's own satirical magazine, which he published from the foreign settlement in Yokohama to get around Japanese censorship.
With Bigot himself as a Pierrot looking out the window.
Yeah, highlighting his outsider status and the pressure on the press. It really captures that feeling of surveillance and control.
So when you step back and look at the whole Jiyu Minkan Undu, it was quite a ride.
It really was. An incredibly dynamic, messy, but ultimately foundational period.
Driven by this real desire for representation, for liberty.
Absolutely. And even though it faced huge challenges, government pushback, internal fights, economic problems, it absolutely laid the groundwork. Political parties, constitutional government, they wouldn't have happened the way they did without this movement.
All those debates about different models, British versus German, radical popular sovereignty.
And the government constantly reacting, adapting, suppressing. It shows just how complex shaping modern Japan was. So many forces pulling in different directions.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? When you consider all those different visions people had back then, how much power for the people versus the government. How do those debates still echo today? Not just in Japan, but maybe everywhere.
That's a great question. And thinking about those Shigi Kenpo, those private constitutions, especially the ones with really strong human rights clauses, what parts of those ideas might still feel quite progressive even now? Definitely something to ponder.